So, a topic that we've really been avoiding for as long as possible, but really need to cover, is optionals. Optionals are variables that allow you to store the value nil. And well, what's the purpose of nil? Well, nil just means undefined. Okay, it's a placeholder for when you don't really have a valid thing to store there yet, but you want to have the variable in place. Okay, it's a way of saying, nothing valid is here yet. Okay, it's a placeholder. This sounds very trivial, but it has big implications in your code. But let's just start off with the basics first. So let's say we have var x int equals 3. Okay, we've all seen this before. No big deal. But let's say we want to take that value out and instead throw nil in, because say the state of our program's changed and we want to say, okay, well, x no longer has any valid value at this point in time. Okay, so we want to assign it nil. What happens? Uh-oh, there's an error. The error says, cannot assign a value of type nil to a value of type int. What's unspoken by this error, that seems pretty descriptive, is that you're trying to assign nil to a non-optional variable. Okay? So non-optionals are what we've dealt with the entire time so far, but now it's time to introduce optionals. So to fix this compiler error, if we want to store nil at x, all we have to do is this. Just like that. Question mark at the end of the type, when you declare a variable, says this is an optional version of the type that's right before it. Okay? And so then, whenever you refer to that value, you can assign nil to it. Let's explore this declaration a little bit more. Let's just try printing it first. So we print x at this point, prints out nil. Okay, no problem. But let's say you take that away, so x should be 3, right? So it should print 3, but no, it prints optional parentheses 3. What is this optional wrapping business? So this goes back to what have you really declared here, okay? What you have here is not an int. It's an optional of type int. So it's really a type of a type, if you can think of it that way. Okay. If that's too confusing, just think of it as a special int that can store nil. Okay. But you can't actually refer to it as an int at this level. Okay. It's really a wrapping around an int. That's really probably the clearest way to think about it. It's not an int in itself. And while it's wrapped, it can store either nil or it can store a wrapper around a valid int, okay, but not in itself. So when you print x, it will either print nil, like we saw, or it will print this wrapper, this optional wrapper, around an actual int. Okay, so let that sit for a while. That's a little strange, and it's definitely going to be a new concept for you. But make sure you understand the difference. Now, you might think, wow, this is actually kind of annoying. Like, all of this trouble is just to store a nil. How do you actually use this x? I don't want to see this optional wrapper around my int values everywhere. So how do I get rid of this wrapper? Turns out, luckily, that's pretty simple too. So instead of x, you can just say x exclamation. This exclamation will unwrap the optional. And so then you get to the good value that's inside. Okay. However, be careful when you unwrap an optional. Let's say we go back to assigning nil. Uh-oh, we suddenly broke the program again. Fatal error. Unexpectedly found nil while unwrapping an optional value. And then it gets really angry at you. Okay, but the error is right there at the top. What did we do wrong? Well, like I said before, x, when you had x, you had a perfectly valid optional of type int, okay? That value, that variable x could be either nil or a wrapper around an actual int. But when you dereference, when you unwrap, is the correct term, when you unwrap that variable x, now it's not an optional anymore. Now it's just a regular int. So the problem is the moment you call this exclamation point, then whatever's there has to be a valid integer because it's of type int, not a type optional of type int. So that means that the moment you call bang here, it's going to complain because you assigned nil there, which was fine while it was still an optional, but now this code expects a real int, and nil is not a real int. Okay? Play with that concept for a little bit. Make sure you understand it. That's really key when working with optionals. Let's try some other things. Of course, you can change the type. Okay. And it'll work the same way, right? Okay. Right? Those are all things we did with the int. I'm just doing them on the string for you to see that it works the same way. Now, what happens when you assign an optional to another variable? So let's say you have var y. Say you want var y to be equal to x. Now you print y. What do you expect? Oh, it's interesting, right? It doesn't print 3, but it's got that annoying wrapper again. Why is that? Well, it's actually pretty simple. When you assign x to y, you're going to basically be saying, I want y to be the exact same type as whatever x is. Okay, it's doing a straight assignment. So because x is not an int, or excuse me, it's not a string, but an optional type string, that means y will also be an optional. And so hence the annoying optional wrapping, which of course you can unwrap like this. And now you're happy. Okay. Now, this is already complex and confusing enough, and this is probably as much as you really need to know to at least deal with optionals when you see them in code. You basically can decide whether to unwrap or not unwrap them, and to check for nil, and to realize that it may hold nil in certain points in code. Now, if you want to actually save yourself some hassle, sometimes you just know for a long stretch of code you're going to be working with a variable and you don't want to deal with the optional. In other words, at that point in code, you can test to make sure it's not nil. And once it's not nil, you just want to refer to it as a regular variable from then on. How do you do this? Well, one way, which is sort of Apple's best practices way, is to use optional binding. Okay, so optional binding looks like this. If let new x equals x, okay, then do blah, 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 do a bunch of other stuff. Now, what's going on here is really is doing a bunch of things. So it's first testing the value of x and saying, is it nil? If it's nil, then this whole expression gets evaluated to false, and it's going to skip all of this stuff. Okay, it's just going to go on to whatever's afterwards down here. Okay. If it's not nil, then we declare a new, in this case, constant, new x, and assign this non-nil unwrapped value inside x to new x. Okay. What that means is from now on, inside your code, inside this block here, new x is not an optional anymore, but rather the unwrapped, in this case, integer or string, the unwrapped string. that is much more pleasant to work with. Okay, so at this point, you see that mu(x) is nice and easy to work with. It's just a regular string, even though x is an annoying optional. Okay. But what's nice about this is that it's a concise way of making sure that we do this unwrapping and reassignment in a safe way, because this code inside here will only get called if x is not nil, okay, which means you're not going to crash your program. If you took this out and try to do something different, you may crash your program. Okay, a little more advanced concept, but a good one to know when you're dealing with optionals.